You're listening to From the Chair, and I'm your host, Mike Hamilton. Join us each episode as we talk to athletic directors from across America. We're going to talk about topics like leadership, career development, issues of the day, and I can promise you we're going to have some fun along the way too. So sit back, listen in, and let's dive in. Let's go.
Welcome into today's episode. It's my pleasure to have our guest, the Director of Athletics at Tulane University, Troy Dannen. Troy, thank you for being with us.
Mike, I'm looking forward to it. It's good to talk to you.
Same here. I've got a lot I want to visit with you about because I think that you've been involved in some interesting things, particularly this fall. So I'm going to jump right in on that. And I'm going to start with the NCAA Constitution Committee. I think that it's your engagement with that is significant. I think these are significant times as the NCAA reviews its structure and how that's going to play out among the different divisions. But for me in particular, in this conversation, we're going to talk about Division I and talk a little bit about, if you wouldn't mind, how you have seen that evolve throughout the fall. Obviously, there have been a couple of announcements that have been made so far, but where are we in that process from your perspective?
Well, on the day that we're recording, I think we're about 10, 12 days out from actually getting a vote of the Constitution at the NCAA convention. Assuming that vote passes by a 2/3 majority of all 1,200 schools, we'll have a new Constitution. And then I would say the work starts. Now, let me go back to the beginning of this. You know, the idea and the way this new Constitution was kind of laid out in front of the membership is really not the way it evolved. I don't know about most administrators. I had not looked at the Constitution of the NCAA. Once I was appointed to this committee, I looked at it and I shook my head. I read it again. I shook my head again because it was a hodgepodge, right? And Constitution should define priorities, purposes, goals, objectives, missions. This Constitution was very prescriptive. There was, autonomy was in there. There was some dictates in there that didn't seem to belong in the Constitution. So really, rather than redefine the NCAA's organizational structure, like I think all of us thought going in, really this was more of a matter of setting up the structure to allow Division I to regovern itself, restructure itself. And so doing so at a time when Division II and Division III both have the power and the weight to knock down any votes, since this is a membership-wide constitution, striking that balance and getting into the position where Division I can truly regulate itself in ways that it needs to regulate itself in going forward. And considering that this is really the first time in 3 or 4 decades that the Constitution had been attacked. So it's somewhat unprecedented. Personally, I looked at it as an opportunity of a lifetime because one, I like this part of the business, but two, it hasn't been done and will not be done again during my term as an active administrator. So it was a really unique and challenging opportunity. I will say this: I don't know how it happens without Bob Gates. Secretary Gates. I'm drawn to leadership. I've never been around a better leader. To pull the personalities and the divergent opinions of Division I, II, and III, and then the personalities within those groups together, and get this done on a fairly expedited timetable with seeming consensus of support. Man, what a leader he was, and we were blessed to have him.
Yeah, I want to hit on that for just a minute if I could. It's ironic you bring that up because I've heard that now from a couple of different people that were involved in this, the significance of his engagement. And I just read over the holidays, I guess one of his books on leadership. And I've actually kind of got a marker down in my notes to buy multiple copies of that to send out to AD and other friends of mine who are engaged in leadership because, and specifically as it relates to leadership in athletics and on campus, you probably know if you've read the book, it talks a lot about his work through the bureaucracy of the United States government, but also during his time in the bureaucracy he had to navigate on the Texas A&M campus, right, when he was whatever the title, president or chancellor. So I think it's interesting that you point that out.
Well, it's funny, everyone says the NCAA is the most dysfunctional organization I've ever seen. Well, he was head of the CIA. So if anyone can manage a dysfunctional organization, it was Bob Gates. And to watch him balance, keep his needs, interests, and wants out of it, but and balance getting everyone's input, but not letting it become and evolve into fights and battles that took us away from the real purpose. At the end of the day, the one thing he always reminded us of, and I've said this to our transition committee group as we've had our first meeting and talking about what went well and what didn't in the Constitution process, is that he always reminded us we still have to have a vote. There's going to be a vote. It has to pass. So you can be as idealistic as you want to be, but if it's not going to pass, let's quit talking about it. If the membership's not going to buy it, let's quit talking about it, and really kept us on task in that way.
Well, as you know, historically speaking, as it relates to these matters, the membership is so diverse, right, in terms of geography, philosophy, et cetera, abilities in terms of what's are available to them and resources and so forth. And so to me at least, I'm hopeful that you guys have laid the framework down to take what could be a really giant step forward. And I know there's still, that's probably when the next step of real work begins. But kudos to you and those who've been involved in this. And my understanding too, Troy, is that if I'm not mistaken, there was a significant amount of pre-work done prior to the committee's work to test theories and so forth with athletic directors and administrators across America. And so you guys weren't going into this blindly. You had the power of all of that info at your hands and going into this. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, and there was a lot of, as opposed to subcommittees that do their work and then unveil it, that there was a lot of consensus building along the way. I met with the group of 5 leagues. I met on a weekly basis with all of the group of 5 commissioners, because it just so happened on this particular committee, I was the only person that represented a group of 5 school. And while you don't really represent your schools here, you're representing the membership as a whole. I was the group of 5 guy, if you will. So we talked, we vetted a lot. I bet I took part in another 15 different listening sessions. Met with a lot of different leagues outside the group of 5 along the way, just to float ideas and concepts. Given that, knowing what lies ahead, I think the next 6 to 12 months going through the transition phase of restructuring and reorganizing Division I is going to be brutal. I think it's going to be divisive. There aren't a lot of things in here, I think, in the Constitution as it sits that you can argue against. There are going to be a lot of things that people are going to argue against as we reevaluate Division I as a whole. So I actually think we've kind of been through the easy part of this, if you will. And I think I'm looking forward at least to what lies ahead with the next part.
I think you're spot on with that. So, part of being a leader and part of being a successful athletic director is being able to deal with controversy and change and emerging situations and making contingent plans for that. And you and I had a great conversation earlier this fall just about what you and your staff and teams had to do at Tulane in the light of in the face of the hurricane situation this late summer in New Orleans. And specifically, I'm talking about your move of a host of folks to the Birmingham area, and then how you started your academic year with a number of folks there in Birmingham. I want to hear a little bit about that. But the other thing that I find intriguing in my research, if the research is correct, is that Tulane has a contingency book around this scenario that's been in place since Katrina in 2005. And to take it a step further, what I read, now I'm going to hear your confirmation or not on this, is that it actually goes as far as to have pre-established contracts with hotels and bus services and others in anticipation if anything of this nature were to occur. I'm just interested to talk a little bit more about that, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Well, and Katrina, taught a lot of lessons to a lot of people. One of them was to have that contingency plan. And, when I came, I'm an Iowa boy. I lived in Iowa every day of my life before I came here. So the idea of a hurricane was a little bit foreign. And it blew me away that every year I was signing contracts with hotels and putting deposits down on buses for an event that I had not seen happen yet. But I read the plan every year. We had 2 different meetings with our staff, one in July, usually one at the end of August. to tell everybody, here is what the contingency is. If something happens, here is what we're going to tell the student athletes. Here's what we're going to do. And sure enough, the reason you do have those contingencies, and the reason they were built out of Katrina was we learned the lessons. Let's prepare ourselves better next time. And no matter what, though, Mike, and the funny thing about it, all those contingencies we didn't have any of these contingencies contingent on COVID existing. So obviously our plan was to originally we'd go to Birmingham, stay in a hotel, we'd go work out at Samford and UAB, and hopefully it was going to be a 3 or 4 day thing, when we evacuated and we'd come back. As we went up there and the 3 or 4 days, and we packed for 3 or 4 days. But the Hurricane Ida was more of a direct hit, knocked the power down in the city for weeks. And we were actually up there for 27 days. And so, nobody packed for it. We were running to Walmart and buying socks and underwear and all those other things. But because of COVID, some of the things that were in that contingency plan, and you talk about having to react to, things on a moment's notice, the hotel restaurant wasn't open. And the hotel itself had been shut down because of the lack of traffic. Well, they opened for us because we had the contract and we had all 300 rooms occupied in the Sheraton in Birmingham, but there was no restaurant. So we were paying $50 a day per diem. And I think DoorDash and Uber Eats were the biggest fans of us being up there, because that's really how our student athletes and staff ate, was with their per diem money. And then take it a step further, because of COVID, we weren't allowed to go on to the campuses at Samford and UAB, much like we didn't want people on our campus from the outside with COVID, to protect our own, the integrity of our own campus. So the idea of going to lift weights, something simple, we were going to go into those weight rooms. We were going, in groups of 20 to different fitness clubs in town and lifting, and just a lot of things that you take for granted. And that maybe we had in our contingency plans, we weren't able to do because we were doing this in the middle of COVID. So it was an experience. We had 280 people up there at one time, including 80 of our 120 staff members were up there. The idea was we wanted the experience for the student athletes, as odd and awful and everything else as it was. It wasn't going to be any different than if they were going to be here, from academic support, from our mental health support, to sport administrators, to the equipment room folks. Everybody relocated up there. And the amazing thing from a staff standpoint is a lot of those folks relocated and left their families behind and stayed up there. Now we housed families as we could, but it wasn't necessarily possible to bring everybody's spouses and children and everything else up. So it was home away from home, and the student athletes became the families for all of our staff. We had 7 sports in season, practicing and playing. We were all over town. We were outside. I will say this, there wasn't one obstruction in Birmingham or any of the schools that kept us from doing what we needed to do. Everybody found a way to get stuff out of the way. And you never know how good of partnerships and relationships you have until you hit a time of crisis. And boy, did we have them in everything up in Birmingham.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal story on so many fronts, and I think about, there's not a book that's written that's like how to be an athletic director that you pull off the shelf. And I'm certain that, when you were sitting there in Iowa growing up, you never envisioned something like that, right? But, at the end of the day, when student athletes who went through that experience look back, I would be shocked if they don't have some significant positive memories out of that, in addition to the hard, from the camaraderie of being together with teammates in the time of a crisis, the way that their university supported them and stood up for them during this time. And you've already mentioned, associations with colleagues and that kind of thing that were helpful along the way. So I just think it's, if we talk anywhere nationally or whatever about contingency planning and how you manage your way through a crisis, that's one that you need to be on the dais when they talk about that. So go ahead. I was going to ask you a question about the Oklahoma game, but go ahead. You want to say something else?
Well, I was going to say, a couple of other things that proved to be really important was, because of COVID, Zoom has become a part of our lives, and I don't think any of us really used it or knew much of it before we got into COVID. But we had a couple of sessions with all the student athletes' families, and so they knew what we were doing, and that was here it's one thing to send your child off to college, and sometimes a long way away. It's another thing then when they're displaced because of a natural disaster, and how are you taking care of my son? You taking care of my daughter? And so that was a really, really beneficial that we were able to communicate directly with the parents face to face, and they were able to answer questions through Zoom. And the other, to what you said about the reaction of the student athletes, we survey everyone at the end of every season, and so we just got all the surveys in from the fall sport athletes. And what I was most proud of, there was not one criticism that came out of the fall. A lot of them, were thankful for how we were treated. We understand with we spent $2.5 million in Birmingham in 27 days in order to house everyone and take care of everyone and buy the necessities that we needed to buy televisions so they could play video games in the lobby, things like that, just so there was something to occupy the time. And it was recognized by the students, and you can tell that we did everything we could to make their experience as good as you could possibly make it. So that, I feel better about it today than I even did then after reading the responses and the surveys from our kids.
So in the middle of that, you had a scheduled game with Oklahoma that was due to be played in New Orleans. And I know you had to be looking forward to that. Your teams had to be looking forward to that. The economic benefit to the area, your benefit to your season ticket holders, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously that didn't transpire the way you'd hoped for it to transpire. But there's a good story out of that as well, in that you moved the game to Norman and served as the home team in the stadium there and that kind of thing. And I know Joe was instrumental in helping you walk through all that. Maybe just some, again, I think it's a testament to the camaraderie in the business and of being able to adjust to circumstances. And so if you wouldn't mind to share a little bit about that as well.
Well, I'll walk back to the spring, and Joe, it blew me away because I've never had another athletic director call me as much as Joe called me to talk about contingency plans for storms. And I was like, don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And sure enough, it happened. Again, why you talk through contingencies, there's example after example of what we went through. And it really allowed us to be prepared to make this move. I would tell you, in most cases, we probably would have played the game in Birmingham. And it was our home game. But, I didn't feel, that at the time Oklahoma was the top 5 ranked team in the country. And I didn't want to go into Legion Field in a stadium that any of us were unfamiliar with its really capacity to host games, because it wasn't scheduled to host any games. And just a quick turnaround, from a timeline standpoint, we evacuated Saturday 7 days prior to the Oklahoma football game. We loaded up the equipment truck as best we could and evacuated. The storm hit on Sunday, and on Monday the decision was made to go to Oklahoma and play the game. I got real upset on Monday because some of the Oklahoma folks had announced that the game was going to go to Oklahoma, and frankly, we had decided at the time whether we wanted to play. I had a couple of coaches whose homes were lost in the storm. We had a number of kids and local kids whose families were displaced, and communication was sketchy at best because of the power down here. There were a lot of things that were a lot bigger than football that we needed to sort through first and make sure everybody wanted to play and whether it was the right thing for us to play. And then once that decision was made with the input of the kids, the input of the staff, Oklahoma, couldn't have been a better host. Now, they could have been a better host. We recovered the onside kick with a minute to go and down 5. They could have been a better host letting us score, but it turned out to be a great experience, for us, because we played the game and we were able to. It was nationally televised, and it if nothing else, and I've said this locally, I want resiliency to be a trait, a characteristic, not a way of life. It seems like resiliency has had to be a way of life, but I think our institution got a breath of life by showing that we could go ahead and turn around, and 7 days later we're back on the field, and we might be shut down in some ways, but Tulane's still moving forward.
Yeah. Wow. Um, Shift gears for just a second. There are any number of different things that you have on your plate in today's world that we could talk about in this podcast from all the things we have already talked about, certainly, but things like transfer portal and realignment and COVID and et cetera, et cetera. In fact, I joked with somebody, the fact that if you list the list and COVID's down like number 6 or 7, that tells you what kind of year this has been. But I do want to hit on a couple of those things real quickly. And I may not have the numbers exactly right, Troy, but I think in the transfer portal I saw now there somewhere near 1,500 FBS football players in the portal, over 3,000 student athletes in the portal between the divisions, and so certainly there's been an effect from that. And I don't know that the jury's still out, right? At the end of the day, the jury's still out right now on it. Certainly student athletes are presented with the chance to do something different through the portal. The fact that there are so many in the portal gives rise to a number of questions. Is the process exactly right? What's causing student athletes to want to enter the portal? Who are the beneficiaries? Is the student athlete really the beneficiary? How are schools playing this? Are they getting kids on the way up? Are they getting kids on the way down? That kind of thing. Two questions out of that for you. One is, how have you seen that play out, particularly at Tulane? And then secondly, if you have any formed opinions at this stage of the game about how this continues to evolve or thoughts on that, I'd love to hear what your thoughts might be.
Well, first the impact of Tulane. Tulane, as given the academic requirements here, we're not going to see a lot of inbound action on the transfer portal. You have to have 60 of your 120 hours to graduate. So the idea of usually a sophomore or later transferring prior to graduation, it's not going to. They're not coming in just because of hours in the degree completion path. So for us, inbound freshmen and inbound grad transfers, and as a general rule, we're not going to be much of a beneficiary here. And I would tell you, the outbound so far, we didn't have a transfer portal 5 years ago or 4 years ago or 3 years ago. The outbounds are probably the same as they were 5, 4, and 3 years ago. We just didn't know about them because it wasn't public through a portal.
Yeah.
And most of the kids that leave, are leaving for one of two reasons. One, the coaches tell them in their end of season review, hey, look, there's probably not going to be a spot on the field for you. And if you want to play, you're going to need to find someplace else, and you hope your coaches are candid with them. And so you get a little bit of that, and then the students have decisions to make. And the other reason people transfer is they're not enjoying their experience. It's not just about football. Football is 20, 40 hours a week, but there's 168, 172 hours, something like that in a week, right? So there's a lot of other time that if it's not a good experience, they're going to be looking for someplace else to go. All that said, the impact of Tulane, we've been a net beneficiary of the transfer portal, and I think it'll continue moving forward. I think the portal and NIL should be cautionary tales to everyone moving forward, though. What happens when you don't listen to what's going on in the world, and you have such resolve that we're going to do what we do and not change? We got to the point where the transfer portal and the terms of the transfer portal were essentially dictated to us versus us dictating, and I say us, the whole of the NCAA and its institutions.
Right.
And you hear a little bit now about, hey, we need to back off. We need to put some windows in the portal. We need to do. It's not going backwards. The transfer environment is not going to become less restrictive. But we missed an opportunity, I think, years ago, and I don't know if that's 5 years ago or 10 years ago. We missed an opportunity to evolve and see the as the landscape was changing, as student athlete empowerment and the issues related to student athletes and their ability to move was in the forefront. We didn't respond proactively, and it caught up with us. NIL is the same way. We chose not to respond proactively to these issues, and all of a sudden it okay, the NCAA has a rule, but that rule was thrown up, last second when it was truly out of our control and became the state's issue. and we lost control of it. And if you lose control, if you're not willing to be to see and have a pulse for the changing environment and the changing landscape, and evolve your own rules, when you're too scared of how is that going to affect the competitive balance and what does that mean for me, and instead of looking at what is the whole and the better good for intercollegiate athletics in general, things like this are going to happen. And we're headed into a time now where there's going to be massive deregulation. The Supreme Court decision that we saw this summer, and you can argue whether we as a collective ever should have allowed that to go forward to the Supreme Court. But once it did, that decision is basically telling us there are a lot of functions that we have as an organization right now that need to be deregulated, that are anti-competitive, and things that we're going to wish that were not deregulated. NIL right at the very top of the list. And I can't even begin to tell you what else will be deregulated, but there are going to be a lot of things that we've regulated because of this hope that we were going to establish a competitive balance. And competitive equity and competitive balance is not going to ever occur legislatively, and should have never occurred legislatively, but that's what we did. Now we're going to have to deregulate that legislation, and we're going to see massive changes, massive, in the next 12 to 36 months. We're all thinking about the CFP right now. That whether the CFP expands or not is going to be a speck on the list of changes in 5 years when we look back, and how different the NCAA is going to be, and how different Division I athletics is going to be.
So I would ask you a more generalized question about what are the other things that you see forthcoming in the next 4 or 5 years that rise to that same level. I'll get specific on one, and if you want to dance around it, you can. But I've heard some conversations in some of the groups that I've been around there over the last few months about, and it's been more than anything else, it's been about conversation. It hasn't been with anybody having any specific intent or anything like that. But does this eventually lend itself to, for lack of a better way to say it, the privatization of football and basketball, still somehow in the collegiate model, and then the rest, called the rest of the sports, still maintain what we would call today the structure that we have today, given also the changes that are involved in that. That seems like a significant stretch, right? Is that a thing that you're hearing talked about more? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, as you look at how is Division I going to be restructured, the Knight Commission obviously came out with a proposal that said, let's pull football off to the side and regulate it independent of the NCAA. And let's, we can all be honest with one another. The issues right now are football issues. This is not a basketball issue. This is a football issue in an organization that doesn't sponsor a championship for FBS football, but yet regulates FBS football. And the member institutions are part of the organization. So we're under a lot of other regulations, but yet the championship's not in it. So, do you federalize or, start looking at this as a sport by sport governance issue? Do you pull football out? My opinion is if you pull football out and govern it separately, basketball will be with it in 15 seconds and the NCAA will go away. I think that is I'm scared to death of that particular model. Should football be governed differently inside of the NCAA? You could make some arguments for that. I think that's what sits ahead for the transition committee is how are we going to come up with a governance structure that works when you have budgets from $400 to $240 million inside of Division I. Is there a governance structure that works? And even if you say, okay, it's FBS football, you just look at the differences in the institutions in FBS football and you say, well, it's just autonomy football. Well, look at the differences within autonomy football. Yeah. There's still, 3 to 4 times the spend from the bottom of autonomy to the top of autonomy. So there are only a handful of institutions probably that are similarly situated right now at the very top of autonomy football. And are you going to set up a governance model that basically, addresses the needs and the whims of the 25 that are in that group, at the expense of everyone else? How does all of that come together? I think there's a segment of folks that think the government's going to come in and bail us all out. One, it ain't going to happen. Two, if it does happen, or rather, it will be much worse than any of us can imagine.
Yeah.
There is no one in the world, no business, if you call education a business, no entity that wants the federal government regulating it. And to think that we're sitting there with our hand out inviting that regulation right now, be really, really careful. That to me is in the athletic administrator handbook, page 1, paragraph 1, is do your own job and do not let someone do your job for you. So, part of this process and the transition has to be, I think, finding a way to keep government intervention out, showing that we can regulate ourselves and govern ourselves without needing that external regulation that, frankly, we've already cracked the door to. We've seen with name, image, and likeness. And, how does there's a lot of things we're talking about, Mike. How does deregulation and antitrust, the Supreme Court decision, and name, image, and likeness, and will the federal government help us out, but will that really be a hindrance? How do all those things intersect in the next 12 months? That's why I say it is a harrowing time. And I don't think any of us really, we've spent so much time in the last 24 months worrying about COVID and how are we going to adapt to that? I think we've lost sight of when I say the dangers, I don't know if dangers is the right word, but if we think the boats are rocking now, it's going to be rocking a lot more when we come out of COVID than it is during COVID.
Yeah. It's a little bit like the example of the throwing the frog in the boiling water, or how do you cook a frog? You turn up the water, and all of a sudden the frog's done, right? And so you kind of hope that that's not what we're headed towards here. But these are complicating issues, and I'm glad to hear that you're engaged in them, because it's pretty clear in a very short period of time that you've got a good beat on it. And I know that you have a good relationship with your peers, and I'm sure you guys, you're service leader among those folks too, in talking about this.
I think the challenge, Mike, in any organization that self-governs itself, is how do you take provincialism out? And you use a CFP example. We expect our commissioner, Mike Oresco, to defend and argue the interests of the schools of the American Athletic Conference in those meetings. We're not asking Mike to go out and come back and tell us, hey, I voted for this because it's in the greater good of football. But yet, who is looking out for the greater good here? And who is it goes back to Bob Gates, who doesn't have any standing in the argument, but is trying to get to the greater good. What is the best for the whole? And, that goes back to, that's what you want the NCAA as an organization. That's what you want out of President Emmert. That's what you have to have out of, that there is no predisposition and there is no bias. There is who is looking out for the whole and who is looking out for the greater good. And that's the leadership challenge that frankly has to be picked up in over the next 36 months. I hope and I anticipate, from what I saw in the Constitution Committee as we get into this transition committee, that people aren't arguing the interests of their own. They're arguing the interests of how do we save college athletics? If we believe it's viable and it's beneficial in the lives of student athletes, how do we save it? How do we make sure we keep the good but yet adjust to the times? Higher ed doesn't adjust very quickly to most anything. But we have to figure out a way to quickly make some adjustments.
Yeah. Okay. So I've got to, if you listen to any of these podcasts, I always end it with travel, food, books, family. I always, the softball question, right? And so I got a couple of things I could ask you, but I'm going to ask you about New Orleans restaurants. New Orleans is famous for its food. We all know the name restaurants that was popular, Commander's Palace, Brennan's, Pascal Manali's, I don't know, I can go on, right? What are and by the way, they're a great host of towels this fall. So I know you know this, I'm sure you got answers to this. Give us a couple of just like, hey, you may not have heard of, but when you're in New Orleans next time, you ought to try what would be your go-to that you would suggest somebody coming into town?
Well, it's funny. I just had this conversation with Mac Rhodes when Baylor was in for the Sugar Bowl. And I said, get yourself out of the quarter. There's some great places in the quarter in downtown. But what I have found, there's two restaurants for me, Clancy's and Gautro's, which are both quintessential New Orleans restaurants. They're local. They're full of locals. There's 10 to 15 tables. Now, they both have different areas, but in the seating areas, there's 10 to 15 tables. They're loud. It's very social. Everyone has a Sazerac on the table. But you don't know their restaurants when you drive by them. There's no sign out front. It looks like a house in the middle of a residential neighborhood. But the food is absolutely amazing. The menu, I don't know what the menu is when you walk in that night because it's not the same menu as it was last week. So I always tell people, get out of the quarter and go into some of these there's restaurants that where the locals go, if you will. It's like in Iowa, where the truckers stop, that's where you want to get your burger. You want to go to where the locals eat in New Orleans, and Gautro's and Clancy's are my two go-tos.
That's awesome. Hey, man, I really appreciate you spending some time with us today, Troy. It's been super informative, and I've enjoyed the conversation. It sounds like we're going to have to do a Troy Dannen part 2 at some point. So thanks for joining me.
I appreciate it, Mike. It's fun to talk through all this because it's an interesting time that lies ahead. But for us here at Tulane, we've had an interesting time just in our immediate rearview mirror. So it has been a year to remember, that's for sure. But I appreciate the time to talk to you today.
Absolutely. You've been listening to From the Chair. I'm your host, Mike Hamilton. Again, today's guest, Director of Athletics at Tulane University, Troy Dannen. We hope you'll join in and subscribe to the series on all the places that you follow podcasts, or to watch it on YouTube each week. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.